Stay home and watch the dogs, Mom. We need some space. My son texted me at 6:42 on a Thursday morning, as if I were a neighbor he barely knew and not the woman who carried him for 9 months and raised him for 42 years. I read the message twice before my coffee even finished brewing. The kitchen still dim with early light slipping through the blinds, the house quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator. Stay home and watch the dogs. It was such a simple sentence, almost harmless on the surface, but something in it felt final, like a door closing softly instead of slamming. For weeks, I had been under the impression that we were all going to the lake house together. The vacation property wasn't just a house. It was the place my late husband Richard and I had saved for, planned for, painted by hand one summer when Daniel was still in high school. Every 4th of July we grilled on the back deck overlooking the water. Every Thanksgiving we drove the 2 hours north even if there was snow on the highway. After Richard passed 4 years ago, that house became the last place where I still felt married, where his flannel jacket still hung behind the bedroom door, and the old wooden dock creaked the same way it had in 1998. So when Daniel mentioned a family trip earlier this spring, I assumed I would be part of it. No one said otherwise. Ashley talked about new patio furniture and repainting the upstairs bedrooms in soft coastal colors. Daniel discussed taking a week off from the firm. They spoke about it all right in front of me at Sunday dinner, as if I were naturally included. That's why the text felt like a quiet correction. We need some space. Space from what? I live alone in a 3-bedroom ranch house in suburban Ohio. I spend most mornings watering my hydrangeas and most evenings reading by the fireplace. I am not exactly crowding their lives. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and stared at the bowl of dog treats I had bought the week before, just in case. I had already cleared my calendar. I had even purchased a new lightweight sweater for the cool lake evenings, folded neatly at the foot of my bed. It wasn't the inconvenience that hurt. It was the assumption that I would simply nod and comply, that I would stay behind and feed their golden retrievers twice a day while they drove up to a house that still carried my name on every official document. I told myself not to overreact. Maybe they wanted time alone. Maybe young families need that. But Daniel is not newly married. He and Ashley have been together for nearly 15 years. I have never interfered in their parenting, never criticized their choices, never asked for more than a weekly phone call and a holiday visit. And yet that text made me feel like an afterthought in my own story. I walked to the living room and sat in Richard's old leather recliner, the one Daniel once begged us to throw away because it looked outdated. The morning sun stretched across the hardwood floors, catching dust particles in the air. I tried to remember the last time Daniel asked my opinion about anything involving the lake house. The property taxes, the insurance renewal, the dock repairs. I used to handle all of it. Lately, bills arrived addressed to both of us, or sometimes forwarded to Daniel directly. At the time I brushed it off as convenience. Now, sitting there with that text glowing faintly in my mind, I wondered if it was something else. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I felt something colder than anger. A quiet realization that roles had shifted without my consent. In Daniel's message there was no invitation to discuss, no explanation, just instruction. Stay home. Watch the dogs. We need space. I picked up my phone again and typed back 3 words. Of course, honey. Then I placed the device face down on the coffee table and listened to the silence settle around me. For the first time, I began to question whether the lake house still represented family memories, or whether it had become a symbol of something they were slowly trying to claim. And as the coffee in my mug turned lukewarm, I understood that this wasn't about dogs at all. It was about ownership, about respect, and about whether I was still seen as the matriarch of this family or simply a convenient caretaker when it suited them. The house felt larger that afternoon, as if the walls had quietly shifted an inch farther apart, leaving more space than I knew what to do with. After I sent my reply, I moved through my usual routine with careful precision, wiping down the kitchen counters, folding a load of laundry, checking the thermostat even though the temperature had not changed. I have always believed that when something unsettles you, the best response is steadiness. That was how I survived the first year after Richard died. I kept the lawn trimmed to exactly 3 inches, paid every bill before its due date, and drove up to the lake house once a month to air out the rooms so they would not smell closed up. I never allowed myself to drift into self-pity. Grief was heavy enough without adding resentment. Yet as I stood in my hallway looking at the framed family photos, I began to see them differently. There was Daniel at 16, grinning beside the half-painted deck railing at the lake. There was Ashley, newly engaged, holding a casserole dish in my kitchen as if she had always belonged there. In each picture I looked solid, rooted, certain of my place. I wondered when that certainty began to thin out. It did not happen all at once. It was subtle. A missed phone call here. A holiday dinner shortened because they had other plans. A conversation that shifted tone when I entered the room. After Richard passed, Daniel stepped up in many ways. He handled paperwork I did not understand, met with the insurance adjuster when a storm damaged part of the dock, insisted on driving me to my annual physical, even though I felt perfectly capable of going alone. I appreciated his help. I was proud of the man he had become, a partner in a respected accounting firm, a father who attended every school recital. But somewhere between helpful and protective, there was a quiet assumption forming that I was fragile. That the house, the property, the decisions required oversight. I told myself it was natural. Children eventually believe they know better. Still, I never signed anything without reading it carefully. The deed to the lake house remains in my name alone. Richard and I made that decision decades ago, long before Ashley entered the picture. It was meant to protect me if anything ever happened. That afternoon I pulled out the file cabinet in my study and ran my fingers along the labeled folders. Property tax statements, insurance policies, maintenance invoices. Everything was in order, as it always had been. Yet I noticed something small that made me pause. The most recent property tax reminder had been addressed to both me and Daniel, even though I had never added his name officially. I remembered him offering to set up automatic payments for convenience. At the time I had been grateful. Now I wondered when convenience becomes control. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, logging into the county property website the way I have done every April for years. The information displayed my name clearly as sole owner. No transfer had occurred. No amendment filed. Everything remained legally unchanged. And yet, emotionally, it felt as if the ground beneath that house had shifted. I thought about Ashley's tone the last time we spoke about renovations. She mentioned replacing the original hardwood floors with something more modern, something easier to maintain. I smiled politely but did not commit. Richard chose those floors himself, measuring each plank with a tape measure he kept in his back pocket. They are not simply boards nailed into place. They are part of our story. Perhaps that is what unsettled me most about the message. It was not merely exclusion from a trip. It was the quiet rewriting of ownership in their minds. The lake house was no longer framed as my retreat. It had become their getaway, their project, their future asset. And I, apparently, was an optional participant. As evening settled in and the sky outside my window turned a pale lavender, I felt a calm clarity begin to replace the earlier sting. I have spent 71 years learning that dignity does not require raised voices. It requires awareness. And awareness had just opened its eyes inside me. The next morning I drove to the lake house alone, without announcing my plans to anyone. The highway stretched out in front of me in a long gray ribbon, bordered by early summer cornfields just beginning to rise. It had been nearly 3 weeks since my last visit, and I told myself I simply wanted to check on the place before they arrived. That was reasonable, responsible even. When I turned onto the narrow road that leads to the property, lined with tall maple trees, I felt the familiar pull in my chest. This was the road Daniel used to fall asleep on in the back seat when he was little, his head resting against a pillow while Richard hummed along to the radio. I parked in the gravel driveway and sat for a moment before stepping out. The house looked the same from the outside. White siding, dark green shutters, the porch swing Richard insisted on installing even though I thought we would never use it. But as soon as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I noticed something different. The living room rug had been rolled up and moved against the wall. 2 paint samples were taped beside the fireplace. A stack of brochures from a flooring company sat neatly on the coffee table. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice to an empty room. I simply walked slowly through each space, taking in the small changes. In the kitchen, a notepad rested beside the sink with Ashley's handwriting listing potential upgrades. Replace countertops. Remove upper cabinets. Open shelving for modern look. It was not the suggestions themselves that unsettled me. Homes evolve. Styles change. What struck me was the certainty in the tone, as if decisions had already been made. I opened the drawer where I keep spare keys and found one missing. Daniel had a copy, of course, but I had not authorized additional sets. I moved into the master bedroom and paused at the sight of Richard's flannel jacket no longer hanging behind the door. It was folded neatly on the bed. That small act felt louder than anything else. Not discarded, not thrown away, just relocated. As if tidying up history to make room for something new. I sat on the edge of the mattress and let the quiet settle around me. The house did not belong to them. Not legally. Not financially. Every mortgage payment had been made from an account Richard and I built over decades of disciplined saving. When we purchased this place 23 years ago, Daniel was still studying for his driver's license. We never framed it as his inheritance. We framed it as our retreat. I walked back to the kitchen and opened the utility drawer where I keep maintenance receipts. A recent invoice for dock inspection had been paid through Daniel's firm account. The payment was highlighted in yellow. I remembered him mentioning he would handle it to save me a phone call. At the time, I appreciated the efficiency. Now I saw something else. A pattern of stepping in before I asked. A gradual shift from assistance to assumption. I stood at the window overlooking the lake, watching sunlight flicker across the water. It occurred to me that perhaps they believed they were helping. Perhaps in their minds I was being relieved of burdens I no longer needed to carry. But no one had asked whether I wanted to be relieved. No one had considered that managing this house was not a burden to me. It was a connection. I took out my phone and scrolled back through old messages. Over the past 6 months, references to the lake house increasingly used the word we. We should redo the deck. We need to update the bathrooms. We can rent it out during off-season. The language had shifted quietly, almost politely, yet decisively. I set the phone down and looked around one more time. The walls were the same. The hardwood floors still creaked near the hallway. But the air felt rearranged. Not by paint or furniture but by intention. I understood then that the message about staying home had not been spontaneous. It was part of a larger narrative forming without my participation. And standing there in the kitchen I once designed with careful measurements written in pencil on scrap paper, I realized that if I did not reclaim clarity now, I might soon be a guest in a place that once carried my name with pride. On the drive back from the lake that afternoon, I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside my car felt appropriate, almost necessary, as if any music would have tried too hard to soften what I was beginning to understand. The road curved gently through the trees, sunlight flashing in brief intervals across the windshield, and I replayed the small details in my mind with careful precision. The paint samples. The missing key. Richard's jacket folded instead of hanging. None of it was dramatic. None of it was cruel. That was what made it powerful. Change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in quietly, rearranging your place in the room without asking permission. By the time I reached my house in the suburbs, the afternoon heat had settled in, and the air conditioning hummed steadily. As I stepped inside, I set my purse on the entry table and went directly to my study. I have always believed in documentation. When Richard and I built our life together, we kept records of everything, from mortgage statements to handwritten notes about appliance warranties. Organization is not about control. It is about clarity. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the digital access logs for the shared account Daniel helped me set up last year. At the time, he said it would make paying utilities easier if he could monitor statements for me. I remember feeling grateful. Technology changes quickly, and I do not pretend to keep up with every update. As I scrolled through the login history, I noticed something that made me pause. Over the past 6 months, there had been multiple accesses from Daniel's office network, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. He had viewed property tax documents, insurance summaries, and the appraisal report from 2 years ago. None of this was illegal. None of it violated anything formally. But it confirmed a quiet shift in authority. The lake house was being studied, evaluated, considered. Not as a memory but as an asset. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. When Richard was alive, he used to say that ownership is not just about whose name is on paper. It is about who feels entitled to decide. I had dismissed that as philosophical at the time. Now it felt practical. I opened my filing cabinet again and retrieved the original deed, its edges slightly worn from being handled over the years. My name stood there clearly alone just as we intended. There had been no transfer. No joint tenancy created. Legally, nothing had changed. Emotionally, everything had begun to. I thought about Ashley's polite smile whenever the subject of the house came up. She never directly challenged me. She simply spoke about improvements as if they were inevitable. She had a way of framing suggestions as progress, and progress sounds reasonable to anyone. But progress without consultation becomes displacement. I walked into my kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, watching condensation form along the sides. I remembered the day we closed on the lake house. Richard squeezed my hand so tightly the realtor laughed. We had worked for that place, budgeting carefully, postponing vacations, driving our old sedan longer than most people would have. It was not inherited. It was earned. And I had never once considered it a burden. If anything, maintaining it kept me active. I scheduled repairs, negotiated insurance premiums, balanced seasonal expenses. I was not being rescued from responsibility. I was being edged out of it. The realization did not bring anger. Brought focus. There is a difference between generosity and surrender. I have been generous my entire life. I have not surrendered. As evening settled in and shadows lengthened across my dining room floor, I made a quiet decision. I would not confront anyone yet. I would not accuse or argue. I would observe. I would gather information. And if necessary, I would remind everyone, including myself, that I am still capable of making decisions about what belongs to me. The house by the lake is more than a structure of wood and glass. It represents decades of discipline, partnership, and trust. And trust, once shifted, requires careful handling. I sat at the kitchen table until the sky outside turned dark blue, feeling something steady return to my chest. Not outrage. Not fear. Just a calm understanding that the next move would be mine. The following morning I called the county assessor's office, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because clarity has always calmed me more than assumption. The woman who answered sounded young, polite, efficient. I confirmed the property identification number, verified the mailing address on file, and asked whether any recent inquiries had been made about reassessment or transfer. She placed me briefly on hold. I listened to soft instrumental music while watching the steam rise from my coffee. When she returned, her voice remained steady. There had been a request for a current market evaluation 3 weeks earlier. The request had not altered ownership, but it had generated a comparative value report. I thanked her, wrote down the date, and ended the call without letting my tone change. A market evaluation is not a crime. It is not even unusual. But timing reveals intention. 3 weeks ago would have been shortly before the conversation at Sunday dinner about repainting the upstairs bedrooms. I walked to my dining room window and looked out at the neatly trimmed lawn. For years I believed that inclusion would come naturally, that Daniel understood the difference between assisting his mother and repositioning her. Perhaps he did not see the line as clearly as I did. Or perhaps he believed the line would eventually fade on its own. Later that afternoon I called the insurance company. I asked whether any coverage adjustments had been requested for the lake property. The representative confirmed that Daniel had inquired about increasing the coverage to reflect renovations. Renovations that had not yet occurred. He had framed the question as planning ahead. Again, nothing illegal. Nothing aggressive. Just preparation. I set the phone down and sat very still. Planning ahead for what? I remembered a comment Ashley made during Easter brunch about rental income potential during peak season. She spoke casually, mentioning that lakefront properties in our area could generate several $1,000s per week during July. At the time I nodded politely, assuming it was a passing observation. Now I recognized it as research. The pattern no longer felt abstract. It felt organized. I returned to my study and opened the appraisal report from 2 years ago, the one Daniel accessed multiple times. The estimated value had increased substantially since we purchased the property. Lakefront land does that. It appreciates quietly, steadily, often faster than people expect. I traced the printed numbers with my finger and considered the possibility that in their minds, the house represented opportunity more than memory. That does not make them villains. It makes them practical. But practicality without conversation becomes presumption. I did not feel betrayed. Not yet. I felt measured, as if I were being evaluated alongside the property itself. My age, my independence, my timeline. I imagined the internal logic they might use. She does not go up there as often anymore. The maintenance is time-consuming. We could manage it better. Eventually it will be ours anyway. Eventually is a powerful word. It allows people to justify present decisions based on future expectations. I stood and walked to the hallway where Richard's portrait hangs. His smile in the photograph is calm, almost amused. He always believed in quiet strategy. If something unsettled him, he did not rush to confront it. He gathered facts first. He once told Daniel when he was a teenager arguing about borrowing the car, "That respect is not taken. It is maintained." I wondered whether Daniel remembered that. As the afternoon light softened into early evening, I opened my laptop once more and searched for recent sales in the Lake community. Several properties similar to ours had sold within the past 6 months. Some for prices higher than the appraisal estimate. The market was strong. Buyers were motivated. I closed the browser and folded my hands together. Information has weight. And I now held enough of it to understand that this situation was not drifting. It was moving. Slowly. Quietly. Intentionally. I felt no urgency to react impulsively. Impulse is for those who feel cornered. I did not feel cornered. I felt aware. And awareness, when paired with patience, becomes leverage. The following day I scheduled an appointment with an attorney I had not spoken to in years. A quiet man named Thomas Green who handled the estate paperwork after Richard passed. I did not tell Daniel. I did not mention it to Ashley. There was no need to create alarm where none had yet been declared. I simply called, explained that I wanted to review my current property arrangements, and accepted the first available time slot on Thursday afternoon. The law office sat in a modest brick building downtown, with neatly trimmed hedges and a brass plaque by the door. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Thomas looked older, thinner perhaps, but his handshake remained firm and steady. We sat across from each other in a small conference room with a long oak table. I placed the original deed in front of him along with the latest appraisal report and insurance documents. I spoke calmly, outlining the recent inquiries made by Daniel regarding evaluation and coverage. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound notebook. When I finished, he adjusted his glasses and confirmed what I already knew. The property remained solely in my name. No automatic transfer clause existed. No joint ownership had been created. Legally, my authority was absolute. I asked him one simple question. If I chose to sell the property tomorrow, would there be any procedural obstacle? He shook his head. None at all. The decision would be entirely mine. We discussed potential tax implications, capital gains considerations, and the current strength of the real estate market in our county. He mentioned that lakefront homes had seen increased demand over the past year, especially among buyers seeking seasonal retreats within driving distance of major cities. He advised that, if I were contemplating a sale, timing was favorable. I did not commit to anything during that meeting. I simply gathered information. Before leaving, I asked him to update my estate documents to reflect my current wishes, clarifying distribution plans without assuming future intentions. Control, I have learned, is not about dominating others. It is about ensuring your voice remains present in decisions that affect your life. When I stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, I felt lighter. Not because I had taken action, but because I had confirmed my capacity to do so. On the drive home, I passed a real estate office near the Lake community, its front window displaying glossy photographs of recently sold properties. I slowed my car slightly as I glanced at the listings. Each image showed wide decks, sparkling water views, and captions highlighting investment potential. Investment potential. The phrase echoed quietly in my mind. That evening Daniel called to confirm travel plans. His tone was upbeat, distracted, as if multitasking. He thanked me for watching the dogs and mentioned that they would leave early Saturday morning. I listened carefully, noting that he referred to the lake house as our place only once, and even then it sounded habitual rather than intentional. When he finished outlining their itinerary, I wished him a pleasant trip and ended the call without confrontation. Afterward, I walked into my study and opened a blank legal pad. I wrote down 3 columns. Sentiment. Value. Autonomy. Under sentiment, I listed memories, traditions, Richard's jacket, Daniel as a boy jumping from the dock into the water. Under value, I wrote current market estimates, rising property demand, seasonal rental income projections. Under autonomy, I wrote one simple sentence. It is still mine. I stared at those words for several minutes. There is a particular kind of strength that comes from recognizing you have options. I did not feel threatened. I felt prepared. Prepared to decide not out of emotion, but out of clarity. And clarity, once established, rarely fades. They left early Saturday morning just as Daniel said they would. At 7:15 he sent a brief message saying they were on the road and would reach the lake before noon. I replied with a simple wish for safe travel, and then placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I waited until 9 o'clock before making my own call. The real estate office I had passed earlier in the week answered on the second ring. A woman named Claire introduced herself with a steady professional tone. I told her I owned a lakefront property in the northern part of the county and wanted a confidential market assessment. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She simply scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. By 11 I was back on the highway, driving north again under a sky that felt impossibly clear. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel reckless. I felt precise. When I arrived, Daniel's car was already in the driveway. Laughter drifted faintly from inside the house. For a moment I considered turning around. Instead, I parked along the gravel shoulder a short distance away and walked down to the dock. The water shimmered in long silver streaks. I could hear Ashley's voice from the deck, bright and confident, talking about paint colors again. I did not interrupt. I did not announce my presence. I simply stood there and allowed myself to observe what I had built and what it had become in their minds. At 2 o'clock Claire arrived as arranged. She parked directly in the driveway and stepped out with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Daniel opened the front door, clearly surprised. I walked up the path at that exact moment. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. I introduced Claire calmly as the listing agent I had asked to evaluate the property. Silence followed. Ashley's smile froze in place, polite but thin. Daniel asked whether this was necessary. I answered evenly that necessity depends on perspective. We moved inside. Claire walked through each room with a practiced eye, measuring spaces, taking notes, commenting on the lake view and the condition of the hardwood floors. She spoke of comparable sales in the past 90 days, of competitive pricing strategies, of strong buyer demand. Daniel remained quiet. Ashley asked about renovation value. Claire responded professionally that buyers in this market often prefer original features, especially in well-maintained homes. I watched as small assumptions dissolved in real time. When the walkthrough ended, Claire stepped outside to take exterior photographs. Daniel turned to me then and asked directly whether I was planning to sell. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply said that I was exploring my options. That word again. Options. His shoulders stiffened slightly. He reminded me that they had been discussing updates and long-term plans. I replied that discussions require participation from all parties involved. Ashley folded her arms loosely but said nothing. After Claire left, I remained on the porch for several minutes, feeling the breeze move across the lake. Daniel eventually joined me. He spoke about family legacy, about keeping the property for future grandchildren. I listened carefully. Legacy is meaningful, but so is respect. I asked him whether he believed I was incapable of managing my own asset. He hesitated before answering that he only wanted to help. Help can feel like assistance or it can feel like replacement. The difference lies in whether consent is present. I did not argue further. Instead, I drove home that evening with a signed listing agreement in my purse. The house was now officially on the market. I had not declared war. I had not delivered ultimatums. I had exercised ownership. And ownership, when asserted quietly and without apology, has a way of clarifying everyone's position. The listing went live on Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Claire sent me a copy of the online advertisement along with the professional photographs she had taken over the weekend. The images were striking. The lake reflected a pale blue sky. The hardwood floors glowed warmly in the afternoon light. Even Richard's old porch swing looked intentional, almost timeless. The description emphasized original character, private shoreline, and strong market demand. I read every word carefully before approving it. When I set my phone down, I felt neither regret nor excitement. I felt steady. By noon the first showing request arrived. By 3 o'clock there were 4. Claire called to tell me that interest was higher than expected, and that we might receive offers within days. I thanked her and continued preparing dinner as usual, chopping carrots, preheating the oven, moving through familiar motions. Around 5:30 my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice carried a tension he had not displayed before. He had just seen the listing online. He asked whether this was a misunderstanding. I told him calmly that it was not. I explained that I had every legal right to explore a sale, and that I had chosen to do so. He spoke about long-term family plans, about the children loving the lake, about how sudden this felt. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked one simple question. Did you consider asking me before arranging renovations, insurance adjustments, and market evaluations? There was a pause. A long one. He responded that he assumed we were all aligned. I answered that alignment requires conversation, not assumption. Ashley's voice came faintly through the background, asking what was happening. Daniel lowered his tone but did not hide his frustration. He said selling would disrupt future possibilities. I replied that being quietly repositioned in my own property had already disrupted mine. The call ended without resolution. That evening Claire informed me that 2 offers had come in above the asking price, both from buyers prepared to close quickly. I reviewed the terms with deliberate care. Cash purchase, minimal contingencies, flexible closing date. The numbers were strong, stronger than I expected. I did not rush. I slept on it. The next morning I signed the acceptance electronically. By 10 o'clock the property was officially under contract. When Daniel called again, his voice sounded different, less certain. He asked if there was still time to reconsider. I told him that reconsideration would have been easier before the listing agreement was signed, before showings were scheduled, before buyers made commitments. He asked why I had not discussed it further. I explained that I had attempted discussion in quieter ways long before this. Silence met my words. Not hostile silence. Reflective silence. I did not accuse Ashley. I did not question motives. I simply stated facts. Ownership had been shifting in conversation without my consent. I chose to shift it back through action. Later that afternoon I drove to the lake one final time before closing. The for sale sign stood at the edge of the driveway, firm and unmistakable. I walked through each room slowly, touching the kitchen counter Richard installed, running my hand along the hallway wall where Daniel's childhood height marks were still faintly visible beneath layers of paint. I was not erasing history. I was concluding a chapter on my terms. The lake outside shimmered quietly as it always had. It did not belong to any of us. Simply existed. And as I locked the front door and placed the key into my purse, I understood something with complete clarity. Respect does not disappear overnight. It fades when it is taken for granted. And when it fades, it can be restored only by reminding others that you are still capable of deciding what happens next. Closing day arrived with an ordinary kind of sunlight, the sort that does not announce itself as significant. I dressed the same way I always do for appointments, a navy blazer, simple pearl earrings, sensible shoes. There was no dramatic farewell, no family gathering on the porch. The buyers met us at the title office downtown. A young couple with 2 small children who spoke with excitement about summer fishing and quiet weekends away from the city. I listened as they described their plans and felt a surprising sense of peace. The house was not being erased. It was being continued, just not by the people who had already begun to treat it as theirs without asking. When the final documents were placed in front of me, I read each page carefully, just as Richard and I had done the first time we signed for that property decades ago. My signature was steady. The pen did not tremble. Ownership transferred with a clean, decisive stroke. Funds were wired directly into my account before I even left the building. It was efficient, uncomplicated, final. Daniel called later that afternoon. His voice was quieter than before, less defensive. He asked if everything was completed. I told him yes. There was a pause on the line that felt different from earlier silences. Not anger. Not accusation. Something closer to understanding. He said he had not realized how excluded I felt. I replied that exclusion rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives in small adjustments, in decisions made without consultation, in assumptions disguised as help. He admitted that he and Ashley had begun discussing future plans for the property as if it were inevitable. I did not scold him. I simply explained that inevitability does not replace consent. The lake house had never been promised. It had been shared. And sharing requires acknowledgement of the one who holds the key. That evening I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the transfer confirmation on my banking application. The numbers were substantial. More than enough to secure my independence for the remainder of my life. I thought about the word legacy again. Legacy is not a building. It is a lesson. The lesson I chose to leave was not about money. It was about boundaries. I had spent years being accommodating, flexible, generous. There is dignity in generosity, but there is also dignity in drawing a line when that generosity begins to be interpreted as weakness. A week later Daniel came over for dinner alone. He helped set the table without being asked. He listened more carefully than he had in months. At one point he said he wished we had handled things differently. I told him that we both learned something valuable. Respect is not automatic simply because we share blood. It must be demonstrated through action. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing a truth he had overlooked. I do not know what the future holds for our relationship, but I know this much. I am not a caretaker placed on standby when it is convenient. I am not a placeholder until someone else feels ready to assume control. I am a woman who worked for what she owns, and who understands the difference between assistance and appropriation. The dogs were picked up at the end of their trip, wagging their tails as if nothing had shifted. Perhaps to them nothing had. But to me everything had clarified. The house by the lake is no longer mine, and that is acceptable. What remains mine is the understanding that I still possess agency. I still make decisions. I still determine when a chapter closes. And sometimes the most powerful statement is not raised in anger but signed quietly in ink.